It was the kind of town that newspapers forgot to write about. Tucked between two rolling hills, with a single church steeple piercing the skyline, it was a place where people knew each other's names and carried each other's sorrows. But lately, sorrow had become too heavy a burden. Too many losses, too many unanswered prayers, too many coffins carried down the narrow aisle of St. Matthew's Church. The older generation said the town had once been blessed. Harvests had been plentiful, children had filled the schoolyard, and the statue of the Virgin Mary in the chapel courtyard had been a symbol of protection. But over the years, that hope had eroded. Factories closed, families moved away, and sickness seemed to linger in the air like a shadow no one could escape. At the heart of it all stood the statue white stone, weathered by decades of rain and sun, but still radiating an otherworldly calm. Some said the Virgin's eyes followed you when you passed. Others swore they had seen her face glisten, as though with tears on particularly dark days. To many, she was nothing more than carved stone. But to a dwindling few, she remained the last reminder that maybe heaven still watched over them. The story that would shatter the silence began not with the statue, but with a mother. She was young, far too young to have carried the weight of bearing a child. Her baby had been born fragile, with breaths that came in shallow gasps, and no matter how much she prayed or how many doctors she visited, the child slipped away one cold evening, leaving her arms empty and her heart fractured. In towns like this, grief was a public affair. Everyone whispered condolences. Everyone left casseroles at her door. But no one could touch the void that opened inside her. She did not weep in public, but those who saw her eyes said it was like looking at a candle that had been blown out. People began to notice her wandering late at night, a small bundle wrapped in a blanket pressed tightly to her chest. At first, they thought she was clutching a memory, a relic of her loss. But on the night everything changed, they realized the bundle was more than just memory. It was her child, still and silent, and she was carrying him toward the churchyard. The moon was high, the air brittle with winter's edge, and not a sound could be heard except her footsteps crunching against the gravel path. No one stopped her. No one dared. Those who saw from their windows felt something strange stirring in the air. It was as though the whole town was holding its breath. She passed through the iron gates, walked across the courtyard, and came to stand before the Virgin Mary. The statue loomed above her, arms outstretched in stone serenity, as if waiting. The mother knelt, lowered the bundle, and laid her lifeless child at the base of the statue. The wind fell silent. The night deepened. And though no one could have known it yet, the town that had lost all hope was about to witness something that would make the world stop and listen. The town had seen grief before, but this was different. This was raw, uncontainable, and unashamed. The young mother knelt on the cold stone, her knees pressing into the damp earth, her arms shaking as she let the small blanket slip open. Those who later described the scene said it was unbearable to watch. The child's skin had grown pale, lips tinted with the gray stillness that only comes when life is left. And yet the mother didn't flinch. She looked at her baby the way only a mother could see, not death, but every memory of life that had been stolen away. Her name was Maria, though some in the town still called her Mary, as though fate had written her into this moment long before it arrived. She had grown up in the shadow of the churchyard, her whole life spent walking past the Virgin statue. As a little girl, she had whispered secrets to the stone figure, pretending she could hear whispers in return. As a teenager, she had lit candles when her father grew ill, praying with an innocence that only youth can give. But adulthood had stripped that innocence away. Losing her baby felt like a cruel answer to all those years of prayer, a silence louder than any thunder. And yet, in her desperation, she found herself drawn back to that statue. People would ask later why she brought the baby there. Why not bury him, as tradition demanded? Why not let go? Her answer was always the same: because I couldn't. It wasn't rebellion against death, it was refusal. A refusal to accept that the story was over. That night, as she laid her child before the Virgin Mary, the villagers began to gather, first a handful, then dozens. They watched from the shadows, too afraid to step closer, yet too spellbound to leave. No one spoke above a whisper. They said the air was heavy, like the weight before a storm. Some even admitted that every hair on their body stood on end, as if the very air itself was trembling. Maria bowed her head and prayed aloud. Her voice cracked but steady. It wasn't the kind of polished prayer you hear from pulpits. It was jagged, desperate, and raw. She begged the Virgin to intercede, to remember the pain of her own child, to show mercy where the world had not. And with every word, her hands shook as she clutched the little blanket, refusing to release it entirely, as though even her prayer wasn't enough to sever the final thread. People said it was unbearable to listen. Others said it was the purest sound they had ever heard, a mother's heart refusing to accept finality. Some turned away, unable to witness the depth of such pain. Others pressed closer, knowing instinctively that something was happening. The church bell struck midnight. The courtyard fell still. And there, at the base of the statue, the line between faith and madness blurred. A grieving mother had asked the impossible. And though no one dared say it aloud, more than one soul that night felt an answer was coming. Long before that night, before a grieving mother dared to place her child on the cold stone ground, the Virgin Mary statue had already carried a reputation that defied explanation. It wasn't grand like the cathedrals in Europe, nor famous enough to be written about in travel books. It was simple, carved from pale stone, its surface worn smooth by decades of wind and rain. And yet, those who lived in the town swore it was unlike any other statue they had seen. The Virgin's arms stretched outward in quiet invitation, her head tilted ever so slightly as though listening. The sculptor who made her had long since passed away, but old letters revealed something unusual. He claimed he had not chosen the design himself, that he had dreamed of the Virgin night after night, her form taking shape in his mind until he could no longer ignore it. He said her eyes had followed him in those dreams, eyes that weren't cold stone but alive, knowing, sorrowful, and filled with love. He carved exactly what he had seen, and when the statue was unveiled, even the doubters admitted there was something unsettling about how lifelike she seemed. Over the decades, townspeople had whispered their stories. Some said they saw her face glisten with moisture on nights of tragedy, as though she wept for them. Others said the air grew warmer in the courtyard when prayers were spoken beneath her. On more than one occasion, candles placed at her feet were found still burning long after their wax should have been consumed. None of these stories were written down in history books, but in hushed conversations at kitchen tables, they were passed from one generation to the next. Still, as the years wore on, belief began to fade. Skeptics called it coincidence. Children grew up and left town, seeking lives far from the shadow of the statue. Even the faithful began to question. The Virgin remained in her courtyard, untouched, unmoved, waiting. By the time Maria grew into adulthood, the statue had become less a sacred figure and more a relic of a past the town no longer believed in. But on that night, when Maria laid her lifeless child at the Virgin's feet, the stories surged back into every mind that had ever heard them. People remembered the tales their grandparents had told. They remembered the whispers of miracles. And they wondered for the first time in many years if perhaps the stone figure looming above them was not stone at all, but a silent witness waiting for the moment when faith would be tested beyond breaking. The statue stood perfectly still in the moonlight, its pale surface glowing faintly in the cold air. The crowd pressed closer, hearts pounding, unable to look away. And as Maria wept at its base, something intangible but undeniable shifted through the air, like the first tremor before an earthquake. It was then that the villagers realized, if ever the Virgin would move, speak, or act, this was the night it would happen. By the time Maria reached the church courtyard, nearly half the town had stirred from their beds. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open, and footsteps fell in behind her like shadows gathering in the night. No one had called for a procession, yet one formed anyway, neighbors, strangers, even the skeptical drawn as if by a force they couldn't resist. It was not a march of ceremony or ritual. It was silent, wordless, the kind of silence that carries weight, like the hush before a verdict. She walked ahead of them, cradling her child as if he were only asleep, though everyone knew he was not. Her steps were slow, steady, as though she feared that hurrying might break whatever fragile thread held her together. Behind her, the villagers followed in uneven lines, keeping distance, not daring to intrude. Some clutched rosaries, others clasped their hands tight to their chests. A few hung back, crossing themselves as if to ward off what they feared might unfold. The sound of gravel underfoot was the only noise. Not a bird sang, not a dog barked. Even the winter wind seemed to pause, letting the solemnity of the moment deepen. One old man would later swear that the air grew heavier the closer they came to the statue, as if the very world was leaning in to witness what was about to happen. Maria reached the base of the Virgin and lowered herself to her knees. The blanket slipped slightly, revealing the child's still face, pale beneath the moon. Gasps rippled through the crowd, not loud but sharp, like the collective intake of breath when tragedy sits in plain sight. Mothers in the crowd instinctively held their children closer, some turning their faces away as if unable to bear the sight. Fathers gripped their sons' shoulders firmly, anchoring them against the gravity of sorrow. And yet, no one left. Not one person turned back toward the warmth of their homes. They stood rooted in place, as if compelled by something larger than themselves. Some thought it was pity for Maria. Others admitted later it was something else, an energy, an expectancy, the strange pull of an invisible hand guiding them to stay. Maria lifted her head, eyes hollow yet shining with something beyond grief. She did not look at the crowd. She looked only at the Virgin, stone arms reaching outward in eternal embrace. Her lips moved in prayer, though her voice was too low to carry. Those standing closest swore they heard fragments pleas for mercy, for compassion, for the impossible. The procession that had gathered behind her held their breath as one. Dozens of hearts beat in rhythm, though not a single word was spoken. The night hung suspended, as if time itself were waiting for permission to move again. And then, in the silence, a sound broke through, faint, fragile, impossible. The unmistakable cry of a child. The sound was so soft at first that many thought they had imagined it. A faint cry, high-pitched and trembling, like the whimper of a newborn trying to find its breath. But when it came again clearer, stronger, every head turned, every set of eyes widened, and every hand instinctively clutched at a chest. Gasps broke the silence, some muffled behind trembling fingers, others spilling freely into the night. What they had all accepted as finality just moments before was now unraveling before their eyes. Maria froze. Her body stiffened, her hands trembling as she pulled back the folds of the blanket. There he was, her baby, whose skin, once pale and still, now flushed faintly with color. His tiny chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, and his lips quivered as the third cry broke free, louder, fuller, carrying into the courtyard. The sound was fragile, yet it cut through the air like lightning, sending waves of shock through every soul present. The crowd reacted as one body fractured in two directions. Some fell to their knees instantly, clutching the stones beneath them, crossing themselves frantically, whispering prayers and praises through tears. Others stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror, muttering words like witchcraft, trickery, impossible. But whether they believed or doubted, none could deny what they had just heard. The dead had cried. The silent had spoken. The final had been undone. Maria lifted her baby into her arms, tears streaming down her cheeks, her sobs colliding with the cries of the child. It was not the soft grief she had carried before. It was fierce, guttural, the kind of sobbing that comes when despair is torn away by joy too overwhelming to bear. She pressed her face into the blanket, kissing her child's head again and again, whispering his name as though to anchor herself in this sudden, dizzying reality. Those closest to the statue whispered what everyone else was thinking, but few dared to say aloud. A miracle. The words slipped from one mouth, then another, traveling like fire through dry grass. It's a miracle. She did not imagine it. The baby is alive. Yet alongside those whispers came others, darker ones. This cannot be real. It's a trick. Something unnatural is happening here. The Virgin stood silently above them, her stone arms stretched wide as though blessing the moment. Some swore later that her face looked softer, that her eyes held more sorrow and more compassion than ever before. Others claimed they saw nothing but cold stone. But regardless of what they saw, no one would ever forget what they heard. The whispers grew into murmurs, the murmurs into cries of disbelief and devotion, until the courtyard shook not with thunder, but with the noise of human hearts colliding in awe and fear. And through it all, Maria held her child, rocking him against her chest, while the impossible echoed into the night like a sound too holy or too terrifying to belong to this world. The third cry was undeniable. It cut through the cold night like a blade, raw and piercing, silencing even the skeptics who had been muttering moments before. People clutched at each other, some screaming, some weeping, others standing frozen as though rooted to the stone beneath their feet. The sound of a baby's cry is ordinary in most places, but here, in the shadow of the Virgin Mary statue, it was anything but ordinary. It was impossible. Maria looked down at her child, her arms trembling violently as she held him up for the crowd to see. The baby's chest now rose and fell in uneven, struggling breaths. But it was life. It was undeniable life. His tiny fists clenched and unclenched. His eyelids fluttered, and his mouth opened again to let out another wail, louder than the last. The sound was jagged, imperfect, but to every mother and father in that courtyard, it was the sweetest sound they had ever heard. The crowd erupted. Some collapsed where they stood, burying their faces into their hands as sobs overtook them. Others began shouting praises, voices rising to the heavens, as if the courtyard itself had become a cathedral. And yet, not everyone rejoiced. A small group pulled back, terror written across their faces. "It isn't possible," one whispered harshly. "The dead don't return. This isn't holy, it's something else." Their fear mingled with the devotion of the others, creating a chaos of emotions no single word could contain. Through it all, Maria held her baby close, rocking him gently as her tears poured down like a flood. She kissed his cheeks, his forehead, whispering his name again and again, each time like a prayer. Her cries blended with his, the sound of a mother and child reunited in a moment that should never have been possible. Witnesses swore that even the air shifted, growing warmer, fuller, charged with a presence that felt both terrifying and comforting at once. Some of the older townsfolk began to chant Hail Marys under their breath. Their rosaries clutched so tightly, the beads left imprints in their skin. Others stretched out their hands toward the statue, as if expecting it to move, to come alive, to reach down and bless the child. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the Virgin's stone face, searching desperately for confirmation that what they were seeing was real. But the statue remained still, her expression serene and eternal, arms extended in silent embrace. It was as though she had given what was asked, and now watched to see how humanity would respond. The first cry had broken the silence of death. The second had silenced the skeptics. The third had ignited the fire of belief or fear in every soul present. And now, with each small, fragile wail, the world as they knew it seemed to unravel. What had once been a grieving mother's desperate prayer had become a moment no one could forget, a sound that would echo in their memories forever. The cry of life where death had reigned. The courtyard exploded with noise. What had begun as whispers of disbelief now surged into a storm of clashing voices, some crying out in praise, others in fear, some shouting over one another with words that tangled into chaos. The baby's wails continued, fragile but insistent, cutting through the pandemonium like a thread of truth no one could ignore. On one side of the crowd, men and women dropped to their knees, pressing their foreheads against the cold stone, sobbing openly as they prayed. Their voices rose together, calling it a miracle, thanking God, thanking the Virgin, their hands trembling as though they had touched fire. Mothers in the group clutched their own children tighter, many crying harder than Maria herself, overwhelmed by the sight of life springing from death. But another side of the crowd recoiled. A man shouted that this was an illusion, some cruel trick meant to deceive. His voice cracked with terror as he backed away, pointing at the statue as though it were a living thing conspiring against him. "It isn't holy," he cried, his voice hoarse. "It's unholy. Don't you see? The dead don't return. This is not God's work." His words struck fear into some hearts, and a few people followed him, stepping back, shielding their faces from what they could not understand. The two sides collided, in the middle one group proclaiming miracle, the other hissing words of suspicion and dread. The clash was not violent, but it was loud, a storm of reverence and fear, belief and doubt, all swirling in the same sacred space. It was as if humanity itself had been split in two by the sound of a single child's cry. And yet, through the uproar, Maria remained in her own world, rocking her baby against her chest. Tears streaked her cheeks, her lips pressed to his forehead as though she could anchor him to life with her love alone. The child's cries softened into small whimpers, his breaths uneven but present, a fragile rhythm that silenced every other sound in her mind. To her, nothing else mattered. She had walked into the courtyard broken, clutching death in her arms. Now she held life again, however fragile, and no chaos around her could shatter that truth. Some swore later that the Virgin's face appeared changed that night, that the moonlight shifted across her features, softening them into something almost alive. Others argued it was just shadow, just the tricks of frightened minds searching for meaning. But whether it was real or imagined, the effect was undeniable. The statue seemed to stand as the still center of the storm, drawing hearts closer even as it drove others into panic. The priest of St. Matthew's arrived moments later, his robes hastily thrown over his shoulders, his face pale as he pushed through the crowd. His eyes landed on Maria, then on the child. For a long moment, he could not move, could not speak, could not breathe. The cries of the baby filled his ears, and he knew instantly that nothing in his years of faith, study, or service had prepared him for this night. By morning, the story had spread like wildfire. The bells of St. Matthew's had rung before dawn, not in mourning but in urgent summons, and the town awoke to the impossible news. Maria's baby had returned to life beneath the Virgin Mary statue. Crowds poured into the courtyard, pressing against the gates, desperate to glimpse the child who had broken the silence of death. Some came in reverence, carrying candles, rosaries, and flowers. Others came armed with suspicion, whispering that there must be some explanation, some trick, some hidden cruelty behind what they had heard. The commotion soon reached beyond the town. A doctor from the neighboring city was summoned at once, followed by 2 more from nearby hospitals. They arrived with their black bags, their starched coats, and their skeptical expressions. For them, miracles did not exist, only conditions waiting for diagnosis. They pushed through the throng, past the kneeling faithful, and into the rectory where Maria sat, her baby swaddled in her arms, his faint breaths fluttering against her chest. The doctors examined him in silence. They placed their stethoscopes to his chest, checked his pulse, shone lights into his eyes. Their faces grew darker the longer they studied him. One finally muttered, "This should not be possible." Another shook his head and said, "There is no precedent." They began arguing quietly among themselves, throwing around terms hypothermia, suspended animation, misdiagnosis, but every suggestion crumbled under the weight of the evidence before them. The baby had no signs of having been alive during the hours he was thought dead. His body had shown all the markers of death, and yet here he was, crying, moving, breathing. The crowd outside grew restless, demanding answers. The doctors emerged finally, but they had none to give. "We cannot explain this," one admitted, his voice strained. "By every measure, this child was gone. There is no scientific reason he should be here now." His words only deepened the divide. For the faithful, it was proof of divine intervention. For the skeptics, it was an infuriating failure of logic. Reporters arrived next, carrying cameras and notebooks. They asked the doctors again and again, "What happened? How did the baby return?" And the doctors, despite all their training, could only repeat the same hollow phrase, "We don't know." Their uncertainty was splashed across headlines, fueling the fire of controversy that now burned beyond the town. Inside the church, Maria clutched her child tighter, shielding him from the flashing bulbs of photographers. She did not need a doctor to tell her what she already knew. To her, it was simple. She had begged the Virgin for mercy, and her child had cried. No argument, no diagnosis, no headline could take that away from her. Outside, pilgrims were already arriving, some on foot, some traveling miles by car, drawn by the rumor of a miracle. And as they knelt before the Virgin Mary statue, leaving offerings at her feet, one question began to spread from lip to lip, whispered like a secret too dangerous to say aloud. If this was possible once, what else might the statue do? By the end of that week, the town was unrecognizable. What had once been a quiet place where evenings passed with little more than the ringing of the church bell was now a crowded hub of pilgrims, reporters, and skeptics. The statue's courtyard overflowed with candles, flowers, rosaries, and handwritten notes pinned to the iron gates. Families knelt in prayer, their voices rising in desperate petitions. Some wept openly, begging for their own children, their own sick relatives, to be touched by the same mercy that had breathed life into Maria's baby. For many, hope had returned in a way they hadn't felt in decades. Belief surged like a tide, drowning out the doubts that had long haunted the town. People who hadn't stepped inside the church in years now filled the pews, lighting candles until wax dripped onto the floor. Confessions ran late into the night, as if the miracle had not only resurrected a child, but awakened dormant souls. For the faithful, this was a sign undeniable, holy, and clear. But faith, when reignited, often burns alongside suspicion. For every pilgrim who arrived with folded hands, another came with narrowed eyes. Rumors began to spread that Maria had staged the event. Some claimed the child had never truly died, that she had faked his death to manipulate the town, to gain attention or sympathy. Others whispered that the church itself had orchestrated the spectacle to draw crowds, desperate for relevance in a world that had begun to forget it. One reporter published a biting article titled Miracle or Manipulation, in which he accused the town of falling prey to mass hysteria. He cited the power of suggestion, the desperation of grieving people, and the natural human tendency to see what they long to see. It was no miracle, he wrote, but the cruel theater of hope. His words spread quickly, inflaming skeptics and outraging the faithful. The divide was no longer just within the town, it was across the nation. Television stations replayed grainy footage of the courtyard, the sound of the baby's cry captured faintly on shaky recordings. Talk shows debated endlessly, with one guest declaring it a divine act and another calling it delusion. Science offered no answers. Religion claimed its victory, and the space between the two grew wider by the day. In the middle of the storm stood Maria, clutching her baby like a shield against the noise. She did not seek the cameras or the headlines. She did not argue with skeptics or explain herself to reporters. When asked what had happened, her answer never changed. I prayed, and the Virgin answered. Nothing more, nothing less. But the more she refused to explain, the more others filled the silence with their own interpretations, some holy, some hostile. And as the days passed, the miracle became less about her child and more about what people chose to believe. The courtyard at night was a picture of contradiction, pilgrims kneeling in reverence, skeptics pacing with scorn, and somewhere in the center, the Virgin Mary statue silent, unchanging, watching as faith and suspicion warred beneath her gaze. For days, the clergy of St. Matthew's remained silent. Father Thomas, the parish priest, spoke little even to his closest aides, his face drawn and pale as he watched the frenzy grow around the statue. He had been the first to see Maria's child alive in her arms, the first to hear the cries that shattered the night. But how could he explain what he himself could not understand? He had studied theology for years, preached on miracles recorded in Scripture, yet nothing in his priesthood had prepared him for a miracle that unfolded before his eyes. The Church has always been cautious with such matters. To call something a miracle is no small thing. It is not enough for witnesses to believe. The Vatican demands investigation, proof, testimony, and evidence beyond doubt. And so, as the crowd swelled and the debate raged, representatives from the diocese arrived. They wore plain clerical black, but their presence was anything but ordinary. Their task was clear: to observe, to record, and to determine whether heaven had truly intervened or whether human imagination had simply run wild. Their arrival did little to quiet the voices. To the faithful, it was a sign that the Church was taking the event seriously, that what they had seen might one day be declared an official miracle. To the skeptics, it was proof of conspiracy, that the Church was orchestrating the chaos for its own gain. Every movement of the priests, every note scribbled in their journals, was dissected by the press and whispered about in the courtyard. Father Thomas himself was torn. In private, he admitted to feeling both awe and fear. Awe, because he could not deny the sound of that baby's cry still ringing in his ears. Fear, because he knew how fragile belief could be. If this was truly a miracle, it was holy ground. But if it was not, if it was exposed as something else, then the damage to faith would be devastating. The priests questioned Maria gently. They asked her to recount every detail of the night. What prayers did she say? How long had the child been still? Did she feel anything unusual in the air before the cry came? Maria's answers were always the same, simple and unwavering. I begged the Virgin for mercy, and she answered. She spoke with the calm certainty of a woman who had nothing to prove and nothing to gain. When the priests examined the statue, they found nothing unusual. The stone was cold, the surface unblemished, the base unchanged. And yet, those who touched it claimed they felt warmth, as though the stone itself held a heartbeat. The investigators dismissed it as imagination, but the faithful clung to it as further proof. At Sunday Mass, Father Thomas finally addressed his congregation. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the weight of the moment. We must be cautious, he told them. We must not rush to declare what only God can confirm. But know this, whether miracle or mystery, the cry of that child has reminded us all that life is a gift beyond measure. The Church fell silent. Some bowed their heads in reverence. Others clenched their fists in frustration, hungry for certainty. And the Virgin Mary statue stood, as she always had, serene, unyielding, her silence louder than any sermon. At first, the town tried to convince itself that the miracle ended the moment the baby cried. That was extraordinary enough. A life restored, a sound from silence. But as the days turned into weeks, people began to notice things about the child that unsettled even those who had fallen to their knees in gratitude. Maria's baby had been born frail. He had struggled with every breath, his tiny body fragile, his skin often cool to the touch. Doctors had warned her from the beginning that his chances of survival were slim. That frailty was why his death, though heartbreaking, had not been unexpected. Yet the child she now held in her arms was not the same fragile infant she had carried before. He nursed eagerly, his color flushed with health, his movements stronger than any had ever seen. Nurses who checked on him whispered that his heartbeats were not only steady but unusually strong, so strong they said it felt like the rhythm of someone much older, much more resilient. Neighbors who visited Maria swore the child never cried unless he was hungry. His eyes followed them with unnerving focus, too alert for a baby his age. Some said he smiled already, though others dismissed it as nothing more than reflex. But those who saw it described the expression as knowing, almost deliberate, as if the child was aware of the attention drawn to him. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed the Virgin's touch had not only revived him but transformed him, gifting him strength beyond nature. They called him the Blessed Child, a living testament to divine mercy. Pilgrims came from further away, not only to pray before the statue but to glimpse the baby himself, as if his very presence held healing power. Mothers pressed their sick children close to him, whispering desperate prayers, hoping some spark of miracle would pass through touch alone. But others grew uneasy. "Children aren't supposed to be like this," one woman muttered after visiting. "It isn't natural. Something has changed him." Skeptics began to suggest darker possibilities, that whatever force had stirred that night was not divine, but something else entirely. They pointed to his too quick recovery, his unflinching gaze, the unsettling calm that seemed to radiate from him. He should be weak, they argued. Instead, he grows stronger by the day. What kind of power could do that? Maria ignored the whispers. To her, he was simply her son alive, healthy, and safe in her arms. But even she could not deny that something was different. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, she would rock him to sleep by candlelight and feel a strange warmth radiating from his skin, like the faint glow of embers that never died. It comforted her and frightened her in equal measure. And always, whenever she lifted her eyes to the statue standing outside her window, she could not shake the feeling that the Virgin's stone gaze lingered a little longer on her child than on anyone else. The town that once stood half forgotten was no longer the same. Within weeks of the baby's cry, streets that had once been quiet now bustled day and night, with strangers carrying candles, rosaries, and folded slips of paper covered in prayers. Shops that had struggled to survive suddenly thrived as pilgrims filled them, buying bread, water, and trinkets to bring home as keepsakes. The inn, which had rarely seen more than a handful of visitors, was now booked for months in advance. Even private homes began opening their doors, offering spare rooms to travelers desperate to stay near the Virgin Mary statue. The courtyard became a sea of devotion. Mountains of flowers rose around the base of the statue, their fragrance mingling with the heavy scent of wax from thousands of candles. Crutches and wheelchairs were left abandoned against the gates by those who swore they had found strength simply by praying near the statue. Photographs of sick loved ones were pinned to the railings, their faces watching over the crowds as if begging the Virgin to notice them too. Every evening, as the sun dipped low, hymns swelled from the courtyard. People sang with voices raw from travel and tears, lifting their pleas into the night sky. Some fainted from the intensity of their prayers. Others claimed visions of light surrounding the statue, of warmth pressing against their hearts, of whispers in their ears that they could not explain. But not all were convinced. Alongside the faithful came skeptics, journalists, scientists, and critics, armed with cameras and questions. They filmed the pilgrims, scoffed at their devotion, and searched for proof that it was all exaggeration. "It is desperation, not divinity," one reporter declared in a televised interview. "People see what they want to see." Yet even as he spoke, the camera captured the tears on his own cheeks as hymns rose behind him. For the townspeople, life had shifted overnight. Some welcomed the change, embracing the flood of visitors as both a blessing and an economic salvation. Others resented the intrusion, the endless traffic, the noise that shattered the town's peace. But whether they welcomed it or not, none could deny the transformation. The town was no longer invisible. It had become a living story, one whispered across continents, one that pulled pilgrims from places so far away they needed interpreters to pray together. And at the center of it all was Maria and her child. She rarely left her small home now, shielded by Father Thomas and other parish members who tried to protect her from the overwhelming attention. Yet no matter how tightly she tried to close the world out, it pressed in. Some knocked at her door, begging her to let them see the boy, convinced that one glimpse would bring healing. Others hurled accusations, calling her a fraud, a manipulator, a woman exploiting grief for glory. She bore it all in silence, her focus fixed only on the tiny life in her arms. But every night, when the crowds hushed and the last candle flickered out, the statue remained. Still, silent, watching, and the town could not help but wonder, was this the beginning of blessing or the beginning of something it could never control? The miracle had drawn not only pilgrims but also power. With the swelling crowds came disordered traffic clogging the narrow roads, vendors setting up stalls that turned the churchyard into a marketplace, and whispers of fights breaking out when desperate travelers pushed to the front of the lines. What had begun as reverence was beginning to spill into chaos, and chaos always draws the eye of authority. Within weeks, government officials arrived, not in robes or with rosaries, but in dark suits and polished shoes, their cars escorted by flashing lights. They did not come to kneel before the Virgin. They came with clipboards, cameras, and the thin smiles of men who spoke of order while thinking of control. They held meetings with Father Thomas behind closed doors, their voices carrying through the rectory walls in sharp tones. The message, though polite, was unmistakable. The miracle was no longer only a matter of faith, it was now a matter of the state. At first, their demands seemed practical. Barricades were erected around the courtyard. Visiting hours were imposed. Permits were required for vendors. But with each new rule, the faithful grew uneasy. The courtyard no longer felt like holy ground, it felt like a spectacle under surveillance. Soldiers began patrolling the area at night, their presence heavy, their rifles slung across their shoulders. For your safety, officials said. But pilgrims whispered that heaven does not require armed guards. When a group of officials suggested moving the statue to a larger, more secure location, perhaps even a national museum, the town erupted in fury. "She belongs here," shouted an old woman who had prayed before the Virgin every day of her life. "She has stood here longer than you have lived. You cannot move her." Pilgrims echoed her cries, chanting, refusing to let the statue be touched. But officials insisted. "This is not about belief," one stern voice declared on television. "This is about safety, about order. If this statue is truly the source of a miracle, it must be studied, examined, and preserved. It does not belong to one town, it belongs to the nation." His words sparked outrage, dividing people further. To some, it sounded like reason. To others, it was theft disguised as law. Rumors swirled that plans were already in motion to remove the statue under cover of night. The idea sent shockwaves through the faithful. "If they try," one man warned, "they will not succeed. This statue will not move." His words carried the weight of prophecy. For those who remembered stories of holy figures in history, statues that refused to be shifted, relics that grew heavier than mountains when men tried to lift them, the Virgin remained unmoved, arms extended as if welcoming both believer and skeptic alike. But as the presence of officials thickened, a question burned hotter with each passing day. Could the power of men overrule the power of heaven? For weeks, Maria had remained silent, hidden away in her small home with her baby pressed to her chest. She let the world argue about her son, about the Virgin who stood in the courtyard. But eventually, silence became impossible. Reporters camped outside her door. Pilgrims begged to see her, to touch her child. Skeptics hurled insults from across the street. And through it all, Maria did what she had always done. She held her son and prayed. Then one morning, Father Thomas knocked gently and told her the bishop himself had requested her presence. The authorities wanted clarity. The church wanted testimony. The town needed her voice. Maria hesitated, but she knew it was time. She wrapped her baby in a simple blanket, pulled her shawl over her shoulders, and stepped outside into a world that had turned her private grief into public spectacle. The hall was packed. Officials in suits, priests in collars, reporters with notebooks and flashing cameras all waiting. The crowd fell silent as she entered, her child in her arms. She looked tired, worn thin by sleepless nights, but her gaze was steady. She sat in a plain wooden chair at the front of the room, her baby gurgling softly as though unaware of the weight of the moment. The questions began. Was the child truly dead when she carried him to the statue? Had she sought medical help? How long had he been still? Did she imagine the cries? Did someone place the baby at the statue beforehand to create a spectacle? Each question was sharp, cold, designed to poke holes in her story. Maria listened patiently, then answered with the same quiet certainty she always carried. My child was gone. I held him as his breath faded. I begged God to save him. I begged the Virgin to intercede. I carried him to her feet because I had nothing left. And there, in the silence, he cried. The room buzzed with whispers. Some rolled their eyes, unimpressed by her simplicity. Others wiped tears from their cheeks, moved by the raw sincerity in her voice. Reporters scribbled furiously, each deciding for themselves whether her words were confession or revelation. One official pressed harder. You understand what you're saying, don't you? That you claim the Virgin Mary statue restored your child to life? Maria did not hesitate. She tightened her grip on her baby, who let out a small, unexpected coo, as if punctuating her words. I don't claim anything, she said. I only tell you what happened. I prayed, and my son lived. Her testimony was brief, but it carried weight heavier than any reporter argument. The officials left unsatisfied, the priests left humbled, and the townspeople left more divided than ever. Some declared her a prophet of faith, others accused her of delusion or deceit. But Maria herself was unmoved. She had not come to prove anything. She had only come to bear witness. And as she walked back into the sunlight, her baby nestled against her. Those who saw her could not shake the feeling that truth itself had just spoken and the world would never be able to silence it again. The decision came quietly at first, whispered in official meetings and printed in hushed tones in the back pages of newspapers. The Virgin Mary statue was to be relocated. The reasoning was presented as practical. Crowds were overwhelming the small town. Public safety was at risk, and the statue, now deemed a national treasure, should be placed somewhere secure, perhaps in a cathedral or museum, where experts could study it. To the faithful, it sounded less like preservation and more like theft. The night the trucks arrived, the courtyard was already filled with pilgrims keeping vigil. Word had spread faster than the government could prepare for. Hundreds knelt in the cold, candles flickering against the darkness, voices raised in prayer that grew louder as the rumble of engines approached. Soldiers tried to clear the way, but the people clung to the iron gates, some pressing their faces against the bars, others wrapping rosaries around them as though chaining heaven to earth. The crane loomed above the statue, its hook swaying like a predator ready to strike. Workers attached heavy cables to the Virgin's shoulders, tightening them with practiced hands. The crowd held its breath. Metal groaned, machinery roared, and the crane strained against its load. But the statue did not move. Not an inch. The workers tried again, sweat beading on their brows, the machine straining so hard the ground itself trembled. Still nothing. The Virgin remained rooted, her stone arms extended in unyielding embrace. One cable snapped with a sharp crack, recoiling dangerously and sending the crowd screaming back. Another attempt was made with even larger equipment, steel reinforced and engines thundering. The crane groaned, the ground shook, and yet the statue stood as if fused to the very earth. Whispers spread quickly through the watching crowd. She will not leave. She chooses to stay. Some swore they saw the stone face glisten with moisture in the moonlight, as though tears streaked her cheeks. Others claimed the air grew thick, heavy, impossible to breathe, as though heaven itself pressed down on the machines. Officials barked orders, their frustration boiling over, but the workers hesitated. One, pale and trembling, dropped his tools and refused to continue. I won't touch her again, he muttered. She doesn't want to move. His words sent a ripple of awe through the pilgrims, who fell to their knees in praise. By dawn, the machinery was gone, the attempt abandoned. The statue stood exactly as she always had, untouched, unyielding, eternal. Officials offered no explanation, their faces grim and silent as they departed. But for the faithful, none was needed. The Virgin had spoken, not with words, but with immovable silence. From that night onward, no one dared to suggest moving her again. The statue had claimed her ground, and the people believed more fiercely than ever that heaven itself had anchored her there. And in the shadow of her arms, the child who had once cried from death slept peacefully in his mother's embrace, watched over by a stone figure that no human hand could shift. After the night the statue refused to move, something shifted in the air around the town. It was as if the Virgin's immovability had sealed not only her place in the earth but also her power over it. Pilgrims who had come merely to witness began returning with testimonies of their own stories that spread like sparks leaping from a fire, each one igniting new waves of belief. It began with small things. A woman who had suffered chronic pain for years knelt at the base of the statue and stood up without her cane. A father whose son had been bedridden with fever returned days later with the boy walking at his side, the sickness gone without explanation. Merchants whispered that barren women were conceiving after praying in the courtyard. Farmers swore their fields, once dry and fruitless, had begun to bloom again after they left offerings at the statue's feet. Soon, the stories grew stranger, more wondrous. Pilgrims claimed the statue's eyes glistened as though alive, tears appearing and vanishing in the glow of candlelight. Some reported hearing faint whispers when they prayed, soft, maternal, words they could not understand yet felt in their hearts. Others swore that when the wind passed through the courtyard, it carried the scent of roses, even in the dead of winter. The abandoned crutches and wheelchairs piled higher each week, forming a silent testament at the gates. The courtyard, once simple stone and grass, became layered with offerings, jewelry, photographs, wedding veils, locks of hair, each token carrying the hope of a soul who believed they had been touched by something greater. Doctors returned, not to scoff, but to study. They found themselves baffled again and again by cases they could not explain. Tumors that disappeared, sight that returned, wounds that closed without scar. Some tried to dismiss it as coincidence, as the power of suggestion. But how many coincidences could gather in one place before coincidence became impossible? The church, cautious as always, documented everything. Priests interviewed those who claimed healing, checked medical records, wrote down testimonies late into the night. Still, they hesitated to declare anything official. To them, it was not yet proof, it was mystery. But to the people kneeling on the stones with tears in their eyes, it was more than proof. It was the very presence of God. And through it all, Maria remained quiet, hidden in her home. She rarely appeared in public, yet her name was whispered with reverence. Her child, once lifeless, now thrived with an energy that grew by the day. Pilgrims begged to see him, believing that even a glimpse might pass healing into their lives. But Maria refused. She had been given her son back, and she would not let the world consume him. Still, whether she allowed it or not, the ripples of her miracle had spread. The cry of her child had opened a floodgate, and now wonders poured forth with a force no authority, no skeptic, no human power could contain. And the question began to form in every heart. If miracles multiplied endlessly here, what destiny awaited the town and the world beyond? By now, the little town was no longer a secret. Pilgrims filled every street, sleeping in cars, tents, and makeshift shelters, just to be near the statue. News outlets broadcast live from the courtyard, their cameras fixed on the Virgin Mary as though waiting for her to blink. The world was watching, and with it came the inevitable clash, faith against science, miracle against reason. Medical journals began publishing articles on the phenomenon. Doctors who had once scoffed at the idea of miracles now found themselves pulled into heated debates. Some claimed the healings were simply misdiagnoses or natural recoveries wrongly attributed to prayer. Others admitted, with visible discomfort, that the cases defied every known explanation. "We don't have the language for what's happening here," one surgeon confessed on national television. His words were replayed endlessly, fueling both devotion and outrage. Universities sent research teams armed with instruments, determined to measure what could not be measured. They tested the soil around the statue, analyzed the candles, the flowers, the air itself. They interviewed pilgrims and examined the supposed healings, yet every result ended in the same unsatisfying conclusion: unexplainable. The more data they collected, the less sense it all made. Meanwhile, the faithful saw no need for charts or microscopes. To them, the evidence was living and breathing. Families reunited, bodies restored, lives transformed. They filled the courtyard with chants of Ave Maria, their prayers rising like incense above the hum of cameras and the questions of scientists. For them, belief required no permission from logic. It simply was. The tension grew sharper with every passing day. Heated arguments broke out in the crowd itself. One moment pilgrims sang hymns, the next, skeptics shouted back, demanding proof, calling the entire movement hysteria. Shoving matches erupted, sometimes breaking into fights before soldiers could intervene. The courtyard that had once been a place of quiet prayer now pulsed with both reverence and rage. The church, caught in the middle, struggled to maintain balance. Priests urged patience, reminding all that heaven's works could not be rushed or politicized. But their calls for peace often went unheard above the shouting of those who demanded immediate answers. Was this truly the hand of God, or was it mass delusion, a trick of grief and longing? Maria remained absent from the public storm. She stayed within her small home, her child growing stronger, his presence more unsettling to those who caught glimpses of him. Scientists begged for permission to examine him, to find in his body some secret to explain what had happened. Maria refused every request. "He is my son," she said firmly. "Not your experiment." Her words only deepened the divide. Faithful mothers hailed her as a guardian of holiness, while skeptics accused her of hiding evidence. The world was splitting in two before the Virgin's silent gaze. For believers, this was the dawn of divine renewal. For skeptics, it was a dangerous illusion feeding mass hysteria. And as the divide widened, one truth became clear: no one would leave unchanged. Long after the first headlines faded and the reporters moved on to chase newer stories, the town remained a place divided and yet forever changed. Pilgrims still came, sometimes in thousands, sometimes in handfuls, kneeling at the Virgin's feet as if time itself could not erode the moment that had happened there. The courtyard was never empty, day or night. Even in silence, there was always someone praying, always someone leaving behind a candle or a flower, always someone whispering the story of a child who cried where death had reigned. The skeptics never relented. They wrote books, filmed documentaries, filled lecture halls with speeches dissecting what had happened. They argued that grief, hysteria, and suggestion had woven a powerful illusion. They dismissed every testimony as coincidence, every healing as exaggeration. But the faithful did not waver. For them, no argument, no article, no scientific dismissal could erase what they had seen with their own eyes or heard with their own ears. Maria lived quietly, refusing the fame that others tried to thrust upon her. She raised her child in the shadow of the statue, guarding him fiercely from the endless noise of the world. Neighbors said she aged with a kind of serenity that no sorrow could touch, as though the Virgin's gaze had poured strength into her. Her son grew, not frail and fading as he had been at birth, but strong, bright-eyed, and restless with life. Some whispered that there was something otherworldly in him, a light in his presence that defied explanation. Others insisted he was simply a boy, no different than any other except that once he had cried where no child should have. And always the statue stood, unmoved, unshaken, her arms stretched outward as though forever frozen in that moment of mercy. People claimed that if you stood in the courtyard long enough, in the stillness of night, you could hear it, the faint echo of a baby's cry carried on the wind. Some swore it was imagination. Others believed it was heaven's way of reminding the world that what happened there could never be undone. The town never returned to what it once was. It could not. For those who believed, it had become holy ground. For those who doubted, it remained a cautionary tale of faith run wild. But whether believer or skeptic, no one could deny the power of that night. A mother's desperation had collided with heaven's silence, and from that collision came a sound that still reverberated through every heart that heard it. A child had been laid before the Virgin in death, and in the stillness, against every law of nature, against every certainty of science, he cried. That single cry was more than sound. It was a fracture in reality, a reminder that the line between heaven and earth is thinner than we dared to believe. And though the world may argue forever, the truth remains written in the stones of the courtyard, in the prayers whispered at the Virgin's feet, in the unshakable faith of those who were there. It was the cry that echoed forever, and it still echoes now.